Welcome to Timeless with Vivek Nitur. Our guest today is Amol Dige. Amol Dige is Professor of Physics in Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, TIFR, Mumbai. His main research interest is in the area of high energy physics, with focus on particles known as neutrinos, their nature, and the role they play in astrophysics and cosmology. Amol earned a BTech in Engineering Physics from IIT Bombay in 1992, MS and PhD both in physics in 1994 and 1997 respectively from the University of Chicago. I know Amol right from my days as an undergraduate student at IIT Bombay and very excited to have him as a guest on this program today. Hi Amol, how are you doing?
Hi, doing fine. Okay, nice to talk to you.
So Amol, how are your memories of Saraswati Secondary School, Thane and Ruparel College?
Yeah, so my school was Saraswati Secondary School in Thane. It was a Marathi medium school. And of course, as for everybody, there are lots of memories from the school days and from the school friends. Um, One thing I would like to emphasize is that fortunately, I got many of the teachers who are really passionate about teaching and about really conveying the fun of the subject to the students. Um, our teachers, especially in science, were ones that tried to give us really an insight into what's happening, rather than just simply telling us to make a formulae, and perhaps that helped us in later on. I would also like to mention our teacher of English, for example, who realized that since we're in a Marathi medium school, we will perhaps have some difficulty when we go to college and have to start speaking in English all the time. And she actually made a rule that in her English class, everybody will talk in English throughout. We were scared in the beginning, but that is something that built up confidence within us, and that really helped me in future when I went to Ruparel and later on to IIT and to other places. So yeah, so I think the school days were happy, enjoyable, and inculcated some nice habits and confidence that really helped me in future. Then I was in Ruparel College in 11th and 12th. Here is where my vision perhaps was slightly broader, because now I had so I was from the senior from SSC board in Maharashtra. A lot of people now in our class were from CBSE and ICSE boards, and this meant that people come from a very different background, and perhaps from what I thought, with much more knowledge of subjects like science, mathematics, and so on. It was great because there was a sort of healthy competition and camaraderie between us. We were friends, but we were still competing. For example, if I'm studying for IIT, who does more problems and who solves which problems. We would discuss things in together, and I think I learned a lot from my friends. I perhaps became more ambitious when I was in Ruparel, because I saw people around me who were more ambitious, and of course gaining of confidence. The fact that coming from a Marathi medium school, the fact that now I can speak on par with all these people who were educated in convent schools and English medium schools is something that that really built my confidence up. And of course, science. I think you learn a lot of science during those days from your friends, and not so much from textbooks and your teachers. Colleges very often simply act as conduits where they allow students to come together. But when good people, good students come together and talk amongst each other, I think they exchange of knowledge between them is much more than simply a student-teacher interaction. I observed it at that time during Ruparel unconsciously. Now that I am in the education field, I see it happening to my students. So I think that part was very important, and that's something I took from Ruparel.
So that's very nice to hear, Amol. So how are your memories of Hostel 3 and IIT Bombay?
Okay. Those are something which are really, really unforgettable. Again, I think in IIT, although I must agree that the teachers, most of them were of very high quality, and maybe more than half of them really gave great courses. I think I learned much more from my other friends in IIT, my classmates, my wingmates, and the overall atmosphere in IIT. So let me first tell something about my classmates. Okay, so we were a small batch of 14 students in engineering physics. However, as you know, most of the courses that we had were in combination with electrical engineering. And in some sense, we had this the broader set of about maybe 60 classmates. Having such a small set of people interested in physics actually helps, because that means that tension of competition and doing better than others is not there so much, as all people coming together and trying to learn something. Okay, so it was almost like a small group of 14 people, or at least a subset of them, who are trying to work something out. All of us happened to have very different tastes. It was not that each of us wanted to do particle physics. No? In fact, if you see what some of us are doing, you will find that maybe 1/3 of us are doing something which is academic in physics. Some of us are into actually electrical engineering. They are faculty members in electrical engineering. Some of us are in industry. Some of us are going to business school. Some of us are doing mathematics. One person actually went into linguistics and also does some psychological counseling. So people in our batch really did a very diverse variety of things. Some people liked doing mathematical, theoretical things. Some people liked tinkering around with equipment in the lab, and it was great to have my lab mate, Deepanka Datta, who used to be a tinkerer and who's right now a faculty member doing experimental high energy physics. And there are people with various interests, various talents, even in arts. There are people who are great quizzers. So it was a very diverse batch, and it was really, really fun to be with them. The second set I would like to mention is my wingmates. So I was in Hostel 3, as you perhaps remember. Our wing was called as Seagulls. Now, Seagulls was named after this book by Jonathan Livingston Seagull, in which there is this seagull who wants to soar very high, even when all his other friends tell him that it is not possible to go so high, it will be very hard for the person. Well, somehow the thinking among us friends was that we would perhaps aspire to be like this seagull, who would do their own things and try to go soar as high as possible, even though it might burn our wings. Again, all these people had different interests, different talents, but we understood each other. We have kept in touch. We are perhaps the ones who know each other better than perhaps even our families, and we are the ones who actually have trust in each other even after so long. So this wing and my wingmates have also had a very large role to play in my life. At a broader context, of course, IIT Bombay. One thing about it is, or at least was in those times, was it wasn't so much academic centric. Although it is true that you have to pass your exams and get good marks, extracurricular activities were actually very common. There were many clubs, and you were encouraged to do many other things. I perhaps have spent a lot of my time doing theater rather than doing physics, but it was fun. We must have performed almost 15 to 20 plays during my 4 years in IIT, in Marathi, Hindi, English, and in fact one even in Sanskrit. In fact, one of my teachers in physics department actually used to allow me, maybe I should not say allowed, but to come late to class, sometimes for the 8:30 class, because he knew that my rehearsal would sometimes go until very late in the morning. And he said that, okay, as long as the earlier night was night of rehearsal, if you come late, as long as you study whatever I teach, I will allow you to come late. So there were these people who were also in some sense encouraging while doing other activities. And I think that really helps in the development of your personality. Theater, for example, I think is it's not a really bad background for if you want to do a career as a teacher, for example. Because when you are giving a class, this is the point where at the back of your mind you are used to thinking about how am I presenting. rather than just what am I presenting, right? You are not saying just the dialogues, but you also want to know, for example, how you should speak, how you should do your intonations of your voice, what points you should emphasize, how you should grab the attention of the viewers. And that actually carries through even when you're teaching in a class. You have a subject matter, but what matters is how the subject matter is conveyed to the student. And here the experience of being somebody on stage, or as I did a lot of, in many places actually was a director, this helps because it helps you think about how the same objective can be perceived differently by different people. And that helps in teaching students of who have different ways of thinking and different ways of understanding. So apart from academics in IIT Bombay, which of course was brilliant, I got some really good teachers. I think these are the extra academic things that really enriched my life in IIT.
Amol, did your exposure to theatre at IIT Bombay also motivate you more towards your main research in physics?
I don't know whether theatre made me shift to this, but it did give me, as I said, some qualities that are perhaps good qualities for becoming a teacher. Because in some sense, that's what an actor does, is transferring whatever the writer wrote to the audience, and what a good teacher has to do is to convey the concepts in textbook to the students. Okay, so in the sense of teaching profession, I think theatre perhaps was a good influence. Of course, all this is hindsight. Okay, but well, yeah.
So how are your memories of being a graduate student at the University of Chicago?
Yeah, so I went to University of Chicago to do my master's and PhD immediately after doing my BTech. It was a very different atmosphere. Those were not the days, it was almost 30 years back, when on TV you could see all that happens in the US. So in some sense, that was a change. One thing that was striking to me when I joined Chicago as opposed to IIT Bombay was the presence of liberal arts. So University of Chicago is a liberal arts university, and it actually allows the students, in fact almost makes the student, even if you're doing science, to study various aspects of liberal arts. So literature, for example, or history, or comparative literature, or humanities, and so on. As a result, the graduate students around me were again from a much broader area. In some sense, IIT, we were all engineers, so it was kind of limited. Chicago gave me the exposure to people who were doing not many different things. So at dinner, I would have dinner with somebody who would be discussing Kant on the other side. Philosophy. Chicago had a very great philosophy department. It introduced me to people like Kurt Vonnegut and his writings, for example. I think my limited view of looking at physics or science perhaps became a bit broad when I went to Chicago. I perhaps also got introduced to a more wider variety of English literature, and also to movies. There were movie clubs in Chicago that I was a part of. And I think overall getting an exposure to how people from many different countries think is something that I learned from my experience in Chicago. So again, I'm assuming that you all know about the academics in Chicago. So I'm not telling you much about academics in Chicago. So of course that part is always great. One thing I got introduced to Chicago was doing experimental science. So in IIT, for example, of course we had some labs, but the exposure to experiments was not that great. On the other hand, University of Chicago, very close to it, has this lab called Fermilab, which, as you know, is a particle accelerator, one of the largest. And during those days, it was the largest. I actually worked in the experiment, and that somehow also connected the engineering part of engineering physics that I did in IIT with the physics part, which I liked. So working on an experiment with physics involves a lot of engineering. And although I was passionate about theoretical physics, I never disliked doing engineering. I loved the electrical courses that we did together, for example. So it was good to see that while I am pursuing my passion of doing physics, I can also do something which keep in touch with my engineering background, and that helped me understanding experiments better. As a result, if you realize that I'm not strictly speaking a theoretical physicist, okay, I'm what I call as a phenomenologist. And what phenomenologist does is the phenomenologist takes experimental results or data and connects that with theory. So I sort of work as a conduit between. But the phenomenologist was also a word that, if I'm correct, Kant was the one who really actually talked about it. So in Chicago, I also learned about Kant and phenomenology and legal phenomenology. So yeah, so this combination of experiments sort of led me to my future directions, which, as we will perhaps learn further, had even more branches.
Amol, if I remember correctly, in the early 90s, we didn't have the CERN particle accelerator in Geneva. Is that right?
So Chicago was the largest one, and therefore I was fortunate to be at the right time, because at that time, not only was that accelerator one the largest one, it was being built. So the experiments in the accelerator were being built. I actually ended up in the initial days working on the experiment called as KTEV, KTEV, which was working on, it's called a chaos Tevatron. And my work there initially actually had to do right away from connecting thousands of cables to trying to polish cesium-iodide crystals, which would serve as calorimeter, so on and so forth. So I really got, as they say, my hands into the experiment. It was great fun. Maybe I can tell you one interesting way by which I got into this particle physics thing. So Chicago, as you know, is in winter is very cold. It's very cold. It's very gloomy. Clouds in the sky. You never see the sky for 4 months. Now the University of Physics department had a solution for this, which is to make us sit for 4 months in the basement so that you don't see the sun anywhere. It was called as experimental physics course. So Chicago, the department basement had labs. You had to go choose an experiment, and you do the experiment for about a month or two. No clear instructions were given about how to do the experiment. So while looking at what was available, I came and got hold of many photographs. Okay, these are pictures of really big photographs, negatives, of experiments done with cloud chambers in the 1960s, 1950s. And these pictures, I think there were thousands of them, and from them you could figure out properties of particles. Okay. Now the problem was that this was already 30 years after 1960, and there was nobody in the university at that point of time who knew how to read these photographs, okay, because they are just a mess. We actually managed to find another emeritus professor from Chicago who had later on shifted to paleontology. This Professor Levisetti, and he came back and he taught us how to read these pictures. Now, when you read these pictures that are photographs about particles traveling, you actually get as familiar with these photos as you are to, let's say, your friend's photo pictures. And I see you here on the screen, I know it is you. Similarly, tomorrow, if I see the photograph on the screen, I will know that this particle is an electron or a proton or a muon, something like that. That really was something that hooked me onto doing particle physics. So such small things help you in deciding the course of your life.
So it's really fascinating to know how your interest in particle physics got triggered. And it's very fascinating to know about your working at Fermilab. So could you please also talk about your doctoral dissertation? Was that also in particle physics?
Yeah, so actually my dissertation was in an area called as charge parity violation. Let me tell you what that is in a short. Okay? So parity means mirror symmetry. Okay? So what does that mean? So let's say I'm doing an experiment in the lab, okay, and I take a film of that experiment in the lab. Now let's say my lab has a big mirror, okay, and I have another camera, and I take the shooting of the same experiment in the mirror, and I send you both of these films. Okay? If laws of nature are the same in my world and in the mirror world, then by looking at these two films, you will not be able to figure out which was taken in the lab and which was taken in the mirror. This symmetry is called as mirror symmetry, or it's called as parity symmetry. Now people believed for a long time that parity symmetry is valid in the nature, in the sense that nature basic laws, fundamental laws, are symmetric in left and right. However, in 1957 or 56, it was shown that indeed this is not true. So that was a misconception that was later on proved to be false. There was a second misconception. So for example, we call protons as positive, electrons as negative. But suppose we change the interchangeable charges. Let's say proton was negatively charged, electron was positively charged. Will the atoms be any different? This is called as charge symmetry. So do we have charge exchange symmetry in the universe? And again, naively you would say yes, that's what it looks like. I mean, what's the difference? What is positive, what's negative? Turns out that it is not true. Okay, so that even charge symmetry is not true. Okay. Then the next thing was, what if you look in the mirror and change positive to negative? Now this exactly corresponds to what is called as going from particle to antiparticle. Okay, so the question now is, do particles and antiparticles obey exactly same physical laws or not? So do electrons and positrons have the same interactions, or is there a slight difference? Okay. Do protons and antiprotons are exactly the same or have a slight difference? Okay. The answer is, it had a slight difference. In fact, for showing this in 1964, Professor Cronin from Chicago had got a Nobel Prize. However, when I entered graduate school, which was in 92, what was not clear is, where does this difference come from? So we were not sure whether it is possible that charge parity even state can go to a charge parity odd state. And this was an open question. Okay. Now, maybe this is time to tell you an anecdote about my first year. So there was a professor called Professor Yao Hua. We used to have these lectures every weekend where professors will come and tell us about their research. Okay, so he came and gave this fantastic talk about charge parity evaluation, how that is thing, and how things are unknown like this. So at the end of the lecture, I asked him, that's all fine, this is unknown, but how will we know? And I was expecting, my question perhaps was also not that serious. I was expecting Ishiboshi answer like saying, yeah, we will do many experiments, and sometime we will know. But he said, Amol, we are doing this experiment now, and we will get the answer, and we will be the first people to get the answer. So this was this K-type experiment on which I ended up starting to work. So this again germ that Professor Hua gave was very interesting, which was in science. Sometimes if the world doesn't know the answer, sometimes you will be the only person who knows the answer, at least for a short while. Before you publish and after you realize the answer, you would end up being the first person in the world to know answer to a question. I think that's an exciting part to be of being a scientist. And yeah, that was something that happened during my first year.
So that's really very nice to hear, Amol. The other question about your time at Chicago is about Subramaniam Chandrasekhar, the great astrophysicist and Nobel laureate. Did you ever meet him during your time at Chicago? And if you met him, what were your conversations like?
So let me say, my conversation with Chandra, I used to call him, were quite indirect. Okay? I met him in two contexts. Okay? So one context is that he was a great fond of modern art, especially Impressionism. Okay? And he was a fond of Monet. So was I. And he actually gave lectures, a set of talks in Chicago about the art of Monet and Impressionist paintings. So that was one context, quite apart from physics. The second part, where I got to interact with him more closely, was again because of a coincidence. Because I did not take a course from him. However, his last book that he wrote is called Newton's Principia, and in that, what he has done is he has taken Newton's Principia and written it in modern language. So all the proofs that Newton gave in his old language, which are actually beautiful but very geometric proofs, and for a layman, really, even for a physicist, very hard to understand. You have to really struggle with it. What Chandra did was he converted that book to a book named the same, called Newton's Principia, for modern reader. Okay, so that we have modern notation, we know about vectors, and we know about some sort of algebraic equations and so on and so forth. My office mate by great coincidence, happened to be the proofreader for that book. Okay. And what that meant is that he would proofread the book. If there were any problems, he and Chandra would discuss those problems and try to figure out on the blackboard about how this proof is good or bad, or how we should change certain ways of writing this. And learning basic classical mechanics, which with two people in my room, one of them of course is a stalwart, other is also a graduate student just like me, slightly senior to me, was actually great for me in getting some insights, which perhaps I may not have got if I just had taken a formal course. So I think this is one great memory of Chandra that I have. It's trying to figure out what Newton said, writing it out in a modern language, and he was a person who was very, very precise. Every word in sentence would be at the proper place with commas and buts and also and wherefore and so on. So it was a very great, just being an audience to this great mathematical physicist talking about proofs on Newton. So those are great memories from Chandra.
Do you remember any particular conversations with Subramaniam Chandrasekhar from that period?
Actually, there are no particular conversations. I remember some things about these proofs. For example, I remember him being really happy when he found that Newton had done a mistake of factor of 2 in one of his calculations about tides. And I also remember him mentioning, of course, he was also in awe with Newton, and he said that, see, this person wrote a book, almost with mistakes, but he made a mistake, and I found that mistake. So, So apart from that, there were no casual conversations. Yeah, he was not a very chatty person. He was a very serious physicist. So whatever I talked to him was mainly about physics, and especially in connection with this fields. There was a superstition in those times that after colloquium, when you have tea, if you have your tea after Chandra has his tea, you have to take your tea inside a cup. No, you have to go open the talk and take your tea. And if you take it outside after Chandra's, then you will graduate that year. So people who wanted to graduate that year would try to be behind Chandra in the queue to get the tea after colloquium. Anyway, this is just for fun.
That is very interesting to hear. Very nice to hear about Professor Chandrasekhar finding a mistake in Newton's proofs and finding a factor of 2 missing. This is very fascinating. About which mentors, professors, and researchers influenced you the most in your career?
So one, as I said, was Professor Wah, who told me about CP violation. Other person was my own PhD advisor, is Professor Jonathan Rosner, who first taught me lots of theoretical concepts about CP violation. One was Professor Cronin, who I mentioned some time back, who actually taught us a course on experimental methods in physics. The same course I talked about, in which we had to go to basement, and it was good to see people taking efforts, so that because a student is interested in these photographs, they would really go and find out people who can explain to this person what these kinds of pictures are. Even later on in my life, I have had influence of many of my mentors. I happen to be fortunate in getting in quite a few mentors. People who got me into neutrinos, for example, people who got me into doing astrophysics and made my horizon broader than what it already was. Yeah, it's so let's say my postdoc did, it was Professor Alexei Smirnov. Later on, so Alexei Smirnov was in ICTP Trieste, and Professor Georg Raffel, who was in the Maxwell Institute of Physics in Munich, Germany, where I did my later postdoc. So these people really had a great influence on me. I must also say that the writings of J.R. Nadarikar in Marathi had influence on me in the sense of being able to write about science in your mother tongue. You can perhaps continue.
Which professors at IIT Bombay influenced you the most, Amol?
It's very difficult to say. one of the professors in physics department who was very close to us was Professor S.H. Patil. He was the one who, well, he actually was the same one who I mentioned allowed me to come late to class. But he was the one who is a great theoretical physicist. And he also, again, taught us about the subtle points of doing of physics, theoretical physics. Apart from physics, you remember, I think we did this course together with Professor Agashe about foundations of mathematics. And that was the course in which we learned about Euclid's elements and the philosophy of mathematics. I think that while doing science practically and actually doing science at the forefront, it is important not to lose track of exactly what the big questions in your field are and how you are attacking them, how your research, even though your research may be doing a very small addition to the current knowledge, it's important to know where it fits in this whole framework of knowledge. And that kind of thinking, at least initially, has to be taught to you in some sense. Somebody should introduce you to that kind of thinking, and then of course you can go on your own. I think that introduction was somehow done by this course in Agashe, course by Professor Agashe, I think, which ended up being.
Amol, we were together in Professor Agashe's course on Logic and Foundations of Mathematics.
Logic and Foundation, yes. Sorry, I forgot the name of the course. It was Logic and Foundation.
Before we move to neutrinos, could you also mention the other areas of research like CP violation?
Yeah. So, a big part of my research is involved around collider physics. Okay? What that means is, as you know, there are particle colliders like the Large Hadron Collider, which a few years back discovered the Higgs particle, which got quite a bit of press. These collider experiments are being done, and the LHC is still running. Now, what this collider experiment achieve is that when they collide together, the energy of collision can get converted to particles, and you can see some new particles. Okay, so what it allows us is it allows us to actually see what the laws of nature are at very high energies. Okay? It allows us to see what are those particles that are present at high energies, because high mass particles are present at high energy. Overall, it gives us a picture of how our world behaves. So just like in chemistry, we have periodic table of elements, which tells us or makes us understand how properties of different elements depend upon their atomic numbers. In particle physics, we have what is called the standard model of particle physics. Okay, it tells us that we have certain number of particles called quarks, certain called leptons, certain things called charge carriers. So essentially, it tells us what the elementary particles are and what are the interaction between them are. So it tells you about strong interactions, weak interactions, and electromagnetic interactions. Okay. We now have a complete framework which combines all these three things so that everything can be not just qualitatively shown, but even mathematically written in a very nice compact manner. So this is the standard model of particle physics. So my job is trying to look at experimental results and test standard model, because you see in science we are not satisfied by having an answer, right? We want to always keep on testing if the answer is correct or not. Okay? So our aim as a scientist is to break down the standard model. We want to show it's not correct. So we attack it from all angles, okay? And we try to see how it is not correct. So that is my job. My job is looking for physics beyond standard model in whatever is there in the experimental data. Okay? So that's my job. Look for data, calculate things, look at observables. If these don't match, then we have signals of beyond standard model. Then you want to look for what is that beyond standard model. Do you have new particles? Do you have new interactions? What is it that you have? There are many theories, and my job is to look at the data and distinguish between competing theories. Okay? So I have theory 1, theory 2, theory 3, and then my experiment will tell you which of these theories is true. I go one step further and I say that if you want to distinguish between theory 1 and theory 2, what experiment will you do? And that will be the other direction of my research. Yes, as I mentioned to you earlier, Vivek, my area of research is connection between theory and experiment. Okay. Now, what does this mean? See, right now in particle physics, we have what is called as standard model. Okay. What does that mean? That we have some elementary particles. Okay. We have some forces between them. We know about strong forces, weak forces, and electromagnetic forces. So there's a framework that connects all of these things together for standard model of particle physics. Now, how do we know about this? We know about this because we do experiments at particle colliders, like the Large Hadron Collider that we all know about. Now, at these colliders, what happens is particles collide with large energies, and this energy can be converted into mass. And what it means is you can create particles with greater mass, which normally are not there around us. Okay, which happens with, for example, particles like top quark, particles like Higgs boson, which are created for a very short time during this period. So what I do is I look at this data and I see what this data tells us about standard model of particle physics. Okay. Now that's not our only aim. Okay. Our aim is to destroy standard model. Okay. So any scientist's aim is not to just take answers as given, but to give new answers. So we try to attack standard model from all directions. Okay. Take every observation and see if that is consistent with standard model or not. No, we want to disprove our ancestor scientists and we want to come up with something new. Okay. Unfortunately, standard model has worked out to be so well that it is very, very hard to do that. But that is the job. So we want to find out if standard model doesn't satisfy some observations. If it is true, if there is something new, then the question is, what is it that is bigger than the standard model? What theory is it? Okay. Like I mean, theory 1, theory 2, theory 3. One direction we do is, okay, fine. So this observation favors theory 1 more than theory 2. Okay, so that distinction in theories we do, and we throw away theories that do not work. Second direction we work at is, let's say you have 3 favorite theories, 1, 2, and 3. My job is to come up with experiments or observations that can distinguish between theory 1 and theory 2. I'll go and tell the experimentalist, see, if I want to distinguish between theory 1 and theory 2, do this experiment, try this observation. This might give you something. So this is a back and forth. So my job essentially is to try to look for physics beyond the standard model. Okay. We know that there is something. We have concrete observations that tell us that there must be something beyond that. But in many such things, we are clueless. No, there are lots of things in particle physics that we simply at this point of time have no clue about. Okay. As we perhaps will talk about neutrinos later, the fact that neutrinos have mass is already something the standard model did not think about. Standard model did not give mass to neutrinos. So we do have to do something with standard model. The question is what to do, and that's the question on which many of us are working these days.
That is very interesting to hear, Amol. Moving to the topic that interests you the most, neutrinos, could you please talk about neutrinos and the most important areas of research with the neutrinos, and also please give our viewers some background on neutrinos before you explain the details.
Okay, let me try. Okay, so neutrinos happen to be those particles which are very tiny, almost point particles. They have no charge at all, and they have only weak interactions. Still, they actually cause a lot of things in the world that we don't realize that they are causing. For example, sun shines because of neutrinos. If there are no neutrinos, then the sun won't be able to shine. In fact, as you are sitting nicely in your room and I am sitting here in my room, through each of our bodies, more than 1 trillion neutrinos, so 10 to the power 12 neutrinos, are passing every second. Okay, it's a really large number. All of them are coming from the sun. Okay, at least most of them. And we don't realize that that's happening. If you might perhaps know that the Earth was formed because of a big supernova explosion that must have taken place some billions of years ago. Supernova will not explode if there were no neutrinos to actually push the shock wave and explode the supernova. So neutrinos have really played a very large role in our being here. Okay. The fact that they only are only weakly interacting makes them very, very hard to detect. Okay. So for example, even though I said that 1 trillion of them pass through our own bodies in 1 second, some of the biggest detectors in the world right now, neutrinos, are only able to say see a handful of neutrinos every day, because most of them will pass through completely unseen. On the other hand, the same property makes them very, very useful, because nothing can stop neutrinos. So look at the sun. Okay? If you look at the sun, if you look at light from the sun, the light from the sun comes from the surface of the sun. Right? It doesn't tell you what is inside. On the other hand, neutrinos, because they are so weakly interacting, cannot be stopped by the sun. So when you look at the sun in neutrinos, we can actually see neutrinos coming directly from the core of the sun, which is not true for light. This is true for sun, true for other stars. So what it means is neutrinos allow us to look at objects in the universe which you couldn't have seen otherwise. You couldn't have seen inside them. And that is one of the reasons that I'm fascinated with neutrinos. The second reason that I told you earlier is that neutrinos in the last couple of decades have been shown to have a mass, and the standard model doesn't allow neutrinos to have mass, okay, which definitely means that in the framework of standard model, we need to do something more. Okay. There are many, many such fascinating aspects, but we'll come to them in the course of. But yeah, so remember, I had my PhD actually involved no neutrinos. Okay? So, but right now, because I found them to be so fascinating, that I have shifted to that field and almost spent maybe half of my time doing neutrinos.
So Amol, could you please tell our viewers the story about how you actually shifted to neutrino research?
Okay, that's a kind of interesting story. So this is the situation. Okay, so this is, I have finished my PhD in Chicago, and I shifted to do my first postdoc in ICTP, which is the Abdus Salam International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste, Italy. This is a place which is very well known also as a conference center. It holds many conferences and actually has been very useful in for generations of Indian physicists. Some of the people, some of the stalwarts there were working in neutrinos. I was not. I was working in colloidal physics. I was working with, as I said, particle colloidals. People working in neutrino physics believed that some of the recent observations then showed that neutrinos have a mass, and wanted to go beyond standard model. I was a bit conservative in nature, so I said no. Experiments are problems. I worked on experiments. You can have statistical fluctuations. Maybe something in detector you don't really understand. How can standard model be wrong? So I am not going to do neutrinos at all. However, I promised them that the day you convince me that neutrinos have mass and experiments are correct, because there were results were slightly iffy at that point of time. There were indications but no clear proof. I said, okay, if you prove to me that they have mass, and I will start working with you. Now this was 1998, and there was a neutrino conference in, I think it was in Tokyo, and one of my mentors in ICTP, Professor Alexis Smirnov, had gone for that meeting. Those were the days when meetings were not available on videos. In fact, people used to give talks on transparencies. So for 1 week, my colleague Alexei had gone for this conference, and next Monday, when I was sitting at my table, he brought to me this famous transparency. Unfortunately, I cannot show you right now, but that transparency, he sort of transparency is a photocopy. He put it on my desk, and he says, "No, Amol, here you go." And that transparency was the one which had the final results of the super Kamiokande experiment, which showed that neutrinos actually oscillate. It actually was a transparency made by Professor Takaki Kajita, who got a Nobel Prize later on in 2015. And that transparency convinced me that experimental results are real, and therefore there is really something great to be done in neutrinos, because we have got a chance to explore physics beyond the standard model of particle physics. And that's the time that I got into neutrinos, and I'm just being sucked into the field because it has been so interesting, fascinating, and growing over the last, I don't know, maybe more than 20 years.
That was a very interesting story, Amol. A question I had was that while trillions of neutrinos pass through each of our bodies every second, why is it that some of the neutrino detectors, such as Super Kamiokande in Japan, are able to detect only a few neutrinos per day? So why is there such a big, dichotomy?
So reason for this is interactions. Okay, so neutrinos don't have strong interactions like protons. They don't have electromagnetic interactions like electrons. Okay? They have only weak interactions. Now, weak interactions are orders of magnitude weaker than electromagnetic interactions. So therefore, for example, let me give you an example. No? So maybe, I don't know if you ever did, but in physics, we often do experiments with radioactive sources, okay, in the lab. And in the lab, what we do is, to be safe, we put a lead shielding between the source and ourselves. Maybe the shielding is of lead and maybe 20, 30 centimeters thick, okay, maybe 1 foot thick, and that is enough to stop alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. Now, suppose I say that I do not like these trillions of neutrinos passing through me from the sun, so I want to put lead shielding between the sun and myself. So the question one would ask is, how big a lead shielding would you need? And I don't know if you know, but the answer to this is actually a few light years of light. So which means that when a neutrino passes through something, it almost doesn't interact. It interacts extremely weakly. The probability is very, very small. Okay. As a result, when the neutrino passes through even a huge detector, out of more than 10 to the power 20 neutrinos, only one will interact, and others will just pass through doing nothing. They will just go through the world and go to the other end of the universe. So that's the reason that these are very, very few in number to collect and catch and study. Okay? Although a lot of them actually are around. Neutrinos happen to be the second largest particles in the universe. The largest particles are, of course, photons, light, which is the universe. But number of neutrons in the universe, it's much, much, much more than neutrons or protons or electrons. The world is just full of neutrons. It's just that it's very hard to see.
It was fascinating to learn that one would need a shielding of lead, which would extend to distances of light years in order to shield us from the neutrinos which are passing through us every second. This is completely, I'll say, mind-blowing.
The distance between sun and earth is about 8 light minutes. So that's so we literally cannot stop neutrinos.
Yes.
And this actually also helps neutrinos as a very good candidate for trying to detect nuclear reactions. The nuclear reactions give out neutrinos. And in fact, attempts are on all over the world to use neutrinos for non-proliferation. Because what this means is that any institution or any country, for example, cannot perform a nuclear test or start a new nuclear reactor without neutrino detectors knowing about it. So there is an attempt to try to have a network of neutrino detectors all over the world. Once that is done, it would act as a check, a very democratic check, because this check is independent of what country you are in. And that would perhaps help, to some extent, help in maintaining peace, at least at the nuclear level.
Amol, for the benefit of our viewers, could you please talk about the 3 kinds of neutrinos and the neutrino mass hierarchy?
Okay. So neutrinos happen to come in 3 kinds. Okay. One is called electron neutrino, and what it means is that this neutrino, when it interacts with matter, gives out an electron. The second neutrino called as a muon neutrino, which when it interacts with matter gives out a muon. Muon is a particle just like an electron, but it's just about 200 times heavier. The third particle called as tau neutrinos. This tau neutrino is again a particle which, when it interacts with matter, gives out a particle called as tau particle. Okay. Again, tau particle is about 4,000 times heavier than electron. Now, the interesting thing about the reason behind interest behind these 3 neutrinos is that if you take electron neutrino, for example, it does not have a fixed mass. So if I tell you this is electron neutrino, what is its mass? You do an experiment and find out its mass, you will get 3 different values. Okay? Maybe 60% of time you get a value of 5, and 30% of time you get a value of 7, and 10% of time you get a value of 30. You will not know, because this state, as you know in quantum mechanics language, it consists of 3 different mass items. These 3 neutrinos, electron, muon, and tau, mix amongst each other, and that is the reason why we have the phenomenon called as neutrino oscillations, due to which number of neutrinos that we see on the Earth at experiments used to be different than what we predicted as coming from the sun. It is only in 2002, so less than 20 years ago, that we realized that the reason we find less number of neutrinos on Earth than what we expect from the sun is because neutrinos oscillate, in the sense that electron neutrinos may become muon neutrinos or tau neutrinos. This actually solved the problem which was bothering people right from 1960s, when people started looking at neutrinos from the sun. Why is it that our calculation of neutrinos on Earth is wrong? Because that would imply that we don't understand the sun well. And we should understand the sun well, because that is the source of our energy. Okay? And therefore, these oscillations of electron neutrinos into other flavors has actually helped us in confirming and concretizing our knowledge about how the sun shines. So in this sense, going about these neutrinos is really, really important. You also mentioned about mass hierarchy, right? So as I told you that if you take these 3 neutrinos, you can have 3 different masses. Okay? Now the question is, how are these masses arranged? Okay, if you think of 3 shelves on your bookshelf, okay, we know that if you think of the masses as 3 shelves, we know that 2 of the shelves are very close by. Okay, so shelf number 1, shelf number 2, and shelf number 3. However, it is possible that the 2 shelves which are close by are not at the bottom. It's possible that is shelf 1, shelf 2, and then shelf 3, which is farther away. This question, although I explain now in the language of shelf, actually is very fundamental in trying to explain how neutrinos get their masses. And as I told you, standard model cannot give you masses. So to understand what is this new theory from which neutrinos get their masses, it is important to understand whether the neutrino mass shells are stacked like this, 1, 2, and 3 up, which is called normal, or whether it is called as sort of 1, 2, and 3 at the bottom, which is called inverted. So these are called normal mass ordering, inverted mass ordering. There are many experiments around the world that are going to do this, and in fact, we are also building an experiment in India whose main aim is to do this.
That's very nice to hear, Amol. Could you please comment on a possible 4th neutrino and about the possibility of the neutrino being its own antiparticle?
These are 2 of the other interesting things about neutrino. Okay, so of course we see there are 3 neutrinos in the world. The question is, why should there be only 3? Can there be a 4th neutrino? A 4th neutrino is sort of indicated, although not really firmly shown, in some of the experiments, and people are trying to go back and see if the results of the experiments are actually correct or not. A 4th neutrino also helps in certain astrophysical aspects. Okay, so it helps, for example, in the distribution of galaxies in cosmology. It sometimes helps in the making of very, very massive stars, and so on and so forth. So this is an open question. We do not know, and we are actually trying to study this. We, in the sense, the whole world. There are many experiments which are focused on figuring out what is this neutrino? Does it have mass? Does it oscillate with other neutrinos? Can we see it at our experiments? That's about steroid neutrinos, or the 4th neutrino, which is called a steroid neutrino. The second question you had was about neutrino being its own antiparticle. There is this fascinating possibility of neutrino being its own antiparticle, because among the fundamental particles, neutrino is the only neutral particle. See, electron cannot be its own antiparticle, because electron has positive charge, electron has negative charge, positron has positive charge. Okay, so they can't be the same, charges are different. In the case of neutrinos, the charges are the same, it's 0 and 0. Okay. So it is possible that they are their own antiparticles. Now, This has neither been proven nor disproven. However, this is a scientific question. So there are literally more than 10 experiments, maybe even more than that, which currently are trying to figure out if indeed this is true or not. Turns out that if neutrinos are their own antiparticles, a particular reaction will take place in the decays of heavy nuclei. It's called as a neutrino-less double beta decay. Let's not go into details of that. But this particular reaction, which has never been seen yet on any experiment right now, is being observed in maybe more than 10 different nuclei. Okay, it's being looked for, it has not yet been observed. And that will tell us if it are their own antiparticles or not. If they are, it actually gives us a way to provide answer to another big fascinating question, which is, why is our world made up of matter and not antimatter? Why do we see negative electrons going around positive protons, and we do not see positive positrons going around negative antiprotons? If you see anywhere in the world, everywhere we see atoms made up of positive nuclei and negative electrons. Okay. So why does that happen? So to understand this, if neutrinos happen to be their own antiparticles, no, we will get some answer.
Amol, moving to an area which is very close to your heart, using neutrino detection to predict supernova. So could you please talk about this topic?
Okay, yeah, that's something that I have worked on for quite some time. So imagine a supernova explosion. Okay, let me go into details. Okay, so in supernova explosion, what happens is the shock wave that starts traveling outwards comes and explodes the star. Okay, now when explosion starts happening, neutrinos start coming out. Okay? And remember, neutrinos will not be stopped by the atmosphere of the supernova, they will just come directly to us. Okay? On the other hand, so neutrinos will come with the speed of light. On the other hand, the supernova will explode after the shock wave reaches the surface. Only when it explodes can we see the light, because light cannot come from inside a supernova to us. Therefore, neutrinos have a head start of many hours. It takes maybe 10 hours, maybe about a day to explode the star. So neutrinos started 1 day before. As a result, they will reach to us 1 day before. Okay, 1 day before the light from supernova reaches us. So what that means is, if we have neutrino detectors ready, if they see a supernova in the sky today, they tell me that tomorrow you will be able to see supernova in the sky with optical telescopes, okay, or with your the radio, X-ray, UV telescope. We perhaps can also tell where the supernova happened, because neutrino detectors can tell you where the supernova was. It means the telescopes will know where to direct their telescope so that they can see exactly that region. So that gives us a head start in knowing that this event is going to happen tomorrow. See, supernova exploding is a spectacular event. You do not want to miss even the first nanosecond of this. And therefore, if something tells this to you in the beginning or 1 day in advance, that's always good. There indeed is a network called as Supernova Early Warning System Network, by which if detectors of neutrinos in the world see this supernova, then a message goes to everybody in the world, with all the optical telescopes in the world. And in fact, SMS also comes on my mobile, for example. So I know something is going to happen to me. Very recently, just more than a year ago, not a supernova, but actually a very high energy neutrino was observed from an event called as a blazar in the sky. Once the event was observed, many of the X-ray and gamma ray telescopes started pointing in the direction, and in the next coming days, many of them actually found that blazar. So blazar is something that emits a lot of light and a lot of different rays, even X-rays and gamma rays, but without any warning. It's not periodic, it is intermittent. Okay? So the fact that a neutrino came from there helped the other telescopes to be able to know where possibly something will happen in the next few days or next few weeks. So neutrinos therefore will act as an early warning system for astronomy. It's like a collaboration between one eye which sees neutrinos, the other eye which sees light, and then you can understand more features of this grand phenomenon happening in the sky.
It's wonderful to learn about the connection between neutrinos and astrophysical objects in the universe. Are there any known connections between neutrinos and dark matter?
Um, well, in principle, by definition of dark matter is something with which light doesn't interact. So neutrinos do form a part of dark matter. Okay. However, they form a very small part of dark matter because they are very, very light. We know that neutrinos cannot be very heavy. Okay. So they are a part of dark matter, but they don't solve the whole dark matter problem. So on the other hand, neutrinos can be the particles that interact with dark matter. So there's a lot of research going on about interaction between neutrinos and dark matter, and whether there's something that can cause an effect on the way the universe is formed, okay, on the structure formation, galaxy sizes, and so on.
Could you please tell us about the Indian Neutrino Observatory and its similarities and differences with neutrino detectors in other parts of the world, such as the neutrino detector at the South Pole and Super Kamiokande neutrino detector at the University of Tokyo in Japan?
Yeah, so I mentioned to you some time back that we are also trying to do an experiment, one of whose major aims is to measure this neutrino mass ordering, neutrino mass hierarchy. This experiment is called as India-based Neutrino Observatory. It is going to be based in South India. The current plan is to have it in a place called Bodhi West Hills near Madurai. What we are going to do is we are going to create a cavern inside a mountain. And this cavern will have a very pure atmosphere. Very pure atmosphere in the sense that any direction you see, you will have a rock cover of at least 1 kilometer. And what that does is all the cosmic rays that come from the sky get absorbed in the rock. So inside this cavern will be an atmosphere which is almost free of cosmic rays. What we will do then is we will go to construct the biggest ever built electromagnet in the world. Okay. It is going to be 50 kilotons, okay. So 50 million kilograms of electromagnet. And nothing close to this has ever been built. How does electromagnet help? It turns out electromagnet can help in distinguishing if you get a neutrino or an antineutrino. So this will be the biggest detector on Earth which can distinguish between neutrinos and antineutrinos. The detector that you said, Super Kamiokande, and the one at the South Pole, called an IceCube, are also big detectors. Okay, Super Kamiokande is nearly the same size, same mass as the INO, or India-based Neutrino Observatory. IceCube is actually much bigger. However, none of them can distinguish neutrino from antineutrino. So therefore, when this is built, this is the only detector in the world, okay, only big one in the world. Of course, there are small ones which can distinguish between these two things. And that helps us in doing lots of things. Even for example, tomorrow if something very unknown phenomenon happens in the sky, which gives off neutrinos, this will be the only one which can tell you if neutrinos came or antineutrinos came from. In addition to being able to find out neutrino mass ordering, it can do this. Second nice thing about this detector is you don't need to create neutrinos. Atmosphere of the Earth creates neutrinos all the time. Okay, so we are not going to create any new neutrinos. We are just going to observe what is created by the atmosphere, and just by measuring that, we will be able to tell you about neutrino mass. So this is a passive detector, just sits there, looks at what happens in the atmosphere in the sky, and has the potential of giving you some really fascinating information that no other detector in the world can give. So I'm personally involved in this, and therefore I'm passionate about it.
So it's wonderful to hear about the neutrino detector that is coming up in India. The other question I had was about the possible practical applications of neutrinos in the future, primarily because there's generally a lag between theoretical physics and its practical applications in terms of a few decades or perhaps even a century in some cases. So do you see the possibility of a neutrino-powered internet when neutrinos are used for communication in the future?
Okay. Of course, there is a lag of many, many years, and even what I'm trying to propose is an interesting possibility which might happen in future, but of course will take many, many decades. Um, there's a maybe I'll give you this interesting example which one of my colleagues actually did. Let's say you are trading between Bombay Stock Exchange and New York Stock Exchange, and the signal that you send over phone or over internet will basically go either through the satellites or will go along the surface of the earth, right, through underwater cables. Neutrinos are not stopped by the earth. So you could send a signal from neutrinos to the earth. I wish I had an earth globe around here, but whereas the signal over internet normally will go like this, a neutrino signal can go like this. Okay. And that will save you a very small time. Okay. You don't know exactly, but of the order of microseconds or so. Okay. I don't know whether microsecond helps in trading or not, but that essentially improves the time for your communication, okay, because you're able to go through them. So this is of course a possibility. This has technological problems simply because, as we already talked, neutrinos are very, very hard to detect. So you will have to create a source of neutrinos at one end, let's say Bombay Stock Exchange, and a detector at New York Stock Exchange to be able to receive those signals and do it at reasonably good speed. I must tell you that this has already been done at the experimental level. There was a neutrino beam which started from CERN in Geneva and went to the Gran Sasso laboratory in Italy, and the neutrino beams were sent with a signal. It actually was a Morse code that spelled the word neutrino. Okay, but this was an experimental thing. So to increase efficiency and to make it really practically viable will perhaps take many decades, and of course the involvement of many more electrical engineers like you.
Are there other practical applications, such as using neutrinos for prospecting of oil?
Yeah. So So among the other prospective applications, of course, one I mentioned earlier about this non-proliferation. That was because neutrinos are not stopped. However, neutrinos, when they pass through matter, what you see at the detector depends on the density of matter that they pass through. That's again something that is observed and known. Now, clearly, oil has a different density than Earth. Earth with a density of maybe 2, 3, 4 grams per cc. Oil is about 1 gram per cc. Which means that if you have a detector, a source of neutrinos passes through Earth, on the other side of the Earth, you have a detector. And this beam actually passes through some oil reserves. You will know that they are oil reserves by looking at what you see in the detector. So this will allow you to prospect for oil without really digging deep. You are going to physically dig. You just have to create this. Okay. So again, this is an idea which is right now at the level of speculation, because it is important to create very, very intense sources of neutrinos and very, very efficient detectors. But again, this is something that could happen in the future. People have worked on trying to explore all different things.
It would be really wonderful to see what other practical applications neutrinos can have. I have a more general question which is based on some kind of a speculation. Do you ever see the possibility of having matter and antimatter collision being the basis for energy generation in the future?
I don't know really. Normally, of course, what happens is, in order for, if you just bring electron and positron together, that's okay, they annihilate, but they just give energy equal to whatever their mass energy was. We do create energy from collision of matter and antimatter at particle collision. Right? So that's what happens. The energy of collision actually gets converted into making particles. However, remember that we don't have antiparticles. Okay? Most of the things around us are particles. Okay? So we have to create antiparticles. The way to create antiparticles, at least the one that I know and the one that people know, is convert energy into antiparticles. So the way of creating antiparticles is using energy to make antiparticles. So what if the same antiparticles are also used to annihilate to make energy, what you would be doing is using the energy which was put into make particles into antiparticles, into energy of annihilation. So right now, I don't have a clear answer about whether it is possible or not. I know that at this moment we do not know of a clear way of doing this. Okay, but you can never underestimate human ingenuity. So who knows? We'll see in a few years.
Amol, what are the open and unresolved questions in your area of physics, including neutrinos?
I think more is unknown than is known in particle physics. So, for example, we know that out of this whole universe, if you look at the energy in the universe, only 4% of the energy is in atoms and molecules that we know. Okay? It's called the baryonic part of the universe. Electrons, protons, neutrons, light. All of this only accounts for 4% of the energy of the universe. We have no idea what is the remaining 96%. We know that out of the 96%, perhaps about 20% or so is dark matter, which is some kind of matter, and we are trying to look for it. It is a matter does not interact with light. A large of the remaining part is actually what's called as dark energy. And dark energy we know as object which has certain mathematical properties, but we do not know what it could be made up of. We have never seen matter with such properties. So in some sense, we have no clue about what 96% of our world is made up of. That's very, very important. Even if you now come back to our 4%, as I mentioned earlier, we do not know why we have matter and not antimatter. That's one big question. So how does that help? Then you come to neutrinos and you have the question of how do neutrinos get their mass? You do not know, for example, Higgs particles cannot be neutrinos their mass. On the other hand, there are 100 different ways neutrinos can get mass. You don't know what it is. Another big question is, remember I told you about standard model of particle physics, which combines strong interactions, weak interactions, and electromagnetic interactions. And you will see what about gravity. We have no clue how to combine gravity with the other three interactions. Okay, we hope and we expect that there is a theory of quantum gravity which will be able to be compatible with the standard model. But there are right now just many attempts and no clear solution. So I would see these are the main problems in particle physics, or even beyond particle physics. People are grappling.
It's really amazing to actually learn about the open problems in physics and about the fact that everything that we are familiar with is perhaps only 4% of the known universe. So talking about gravity, where do you stand on the string theory versus the loop quantum gravity debate? Could anything be done to bridge the divide between the two sides?
I stand on a fence with a black cloth on my head because I don't want to be killed from both sides. Actually, I must say that I am not an expert in either of them, so I cannot comment on either of them. String theory, of course, has had a much longer history, and the basics are more well established. What the mathematical structures it has created have helped also in other related fields. It is a consistent theory and is a very good candidate for being the theory of quantum gravity, as I mentioned, which can combine gravity. Loop quantum gravity is something that I do not know much about. However, I know that it is a theory which is relatively new. People are trying to make the mathematical foundations of this theory concrete, and I have no idea how much success they have got. So I stand on the fence. I think in science, you never know which way will succeed. As long as you pursue your way honestly, one of them will be the answer. Remember, even when the standard model was built, there were many people trying to build up a model in different ways. So there must be at least 20, 30 different ways. But finally, experiments told us that one of the ways succeeded. That is our standard model. Right? So finally, theories can think about many different things. but it is the observations and experiments that tell you what actually the world is all about. So maybe we will know about this answer in our lifetimes. Let's see. But these are big questions. And literally hundreds of people, hundreds of brilliant minds have been working on this for many years. So let's see.
Amol, you won many awards and honors, such as Distinguished Alumnus Award from IIT Bombay, the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize, Fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences, and the Swarna Jayanti Fellowship. Which of these awards and honors gave you the most amount of joy and satisfaction?
So it is difficult to say about the awards. Perhaps the Distinguished Alumnus Award from IIT Bombay, because sometimes when your alma mater calls you back and honors you, it's sometimes really very special. However, I think what I find even more interesting than awards, or even more moments of joy, are when you have solved a problem. When you solve a problem, at that point of time, you are perhaps the only one in the world who has solved the problem, who knows the answer. You are, of course, dying to tell the answer to your colleagues and maybe write a paper and publish it. But the point of time when you get that insight and figure out answer to a problem is perhaps greatest joy and satisfaction greater than any award. I'm saying I'm very happy to receive the awards and I really am honored. But they don't compete with those moments.
You are known for your columns and interviews in Marathi and the significant amount of outreach activities that you have done in Marathi in order to reach out to a much more wider audience about science. So could you actually talk more about these outreach activities that you've been involved with over the years?
So what I very frequently do is write newspaper columns in Marathi. I give talks in Marathi at various schools and colleges. The reason I do this is maybe it also comes from the fact that I actually came from basic Marathi medium school. I think that very often people who are used to reading English newspapers or English magazines get a lot of information, scientific information, because good articles are written by really expert people. We do not see much of such things written in local language, Marathi language. I think if we really want science to reach people, it should be written in the local language. I know it's also the case at my home, for example, at my parents, that the newspaper that you would read will barely be a Marathi newspaper. You will not. You may get English newspaper, but it's not every article is not something good. Many of my friends, many of my colleagues, many of the other Marathi people I meet at many places have the habit of going through Marathi newspapers, Marathi magazines. In fact, if you go away from metro cities like Mumbai, you will see that there is a lot of readership which regularly reads these things. They will not go and read English. As a result, when you write in English, what you write reaches a very small number of people. On the other hand, writing in Marathi, A, it reaches more number of people, and B, it is also more appreciated. I think it is important to create a knowledge base in our local languages, so that also, it also in some sense forces me to be able to think about these issues in a very layman language. It also clarifies my mind about what is important, what is not important. I do not want to give technical descriptions and equations when I'm writing an article for a newspaper, for example. Right? So therefore, it allows me to think about what is important. Sometimes I keep my parents in front of me. I say, okay, this is the article that my parents should be able to read and understand. Okay? Although they don't have a background in physics. Okay? So that's the kind of audience that I want to reach. And well, I guess people are reading these things, and the feedback has been very positive. I think I will continue doing this. I also given talks, as I said, in Marathi at various places, and it is if you look at the age group, let's say beyond 40, So if you look at age group below 40 and the people in schools, colleges, and those who have just started doing their, their jobs, they are more involved in their own work and read mainly in English. But people who are slightly settled in lives and want to explore other things would first like to explore things that are easy for them to gain from. And if someone gives a talk to them in their own mother tongue, they can understand it better. And I think so. This demographic age group, for example, is also very interested in listening to what's new things happening in science. So, in fact, even for this, when this COVID started, we actually made a set of videos about COVID in I think more than 12 different local languages. And we saw that these have very wide reach. Yeah. So I think it's very important to convey science in simple language and into local language. So I do my bit. There are of course also other good people.
So Amol, this outreach in Marathi, would reach, students in, say, the rural parts of Maharashtra.
Mhm.
So do you know of any instances where there's a kid in a rural area who has been motivated to pursue a career in science by reading one or more of your articles? Have you ever come across a case like that?
Unfortunately, no. So this I'm not sure about because I don't know of a concrete case which has done that. As I said, I do my own stuff. So as a, keep on writing. Sometimes I do get queries from people who have read my article and students who want to do science and asking for advice about where to do science and what to do and what books to read. So I have done it in that sense, but I haven't really followed up on what these people do. I think it's like, no, you do your job and let things happen the way they are. You contribute your own bit to this aspect of getting more people interested in science.
That's very nice, Amol. And it's really wonderful that you'll be making that kind of a social impact in addition to your work in physics. So would you have any specific advice to young people who are watching this video and who are thinking of pursuing a career in science?
Okay? I think giving advice in the short amount of time and words is difficult. What I would say is the following. I think that a career in science is challenging and hard because it needs learning, knowledge, and also some kind of creativity and some kind of good luck that you are able to come to good ideas. Therefore, you should take up a career in science only if you like science. You should not take a career in science because you want to get awards or get fame or get a lot of money. But you do science because you like doing science. What makes it worth it is, as I mentioned, those moments where you actually solve some problem and realize that you have contributed something new to the set of knowledge. Right? So you are not just reproducing the knowledge, you are not just applying the knowledge, but you are actually creating new knowledge. Okay, that's what scientists do. Okay. So if you like those kinds of things, you should do science. So do it with passion and put in hard work. I think passion and hard work are perhaps the two key things that you need to be able to do good science. But it has sweet fruits. It may take a long time, but it has sweet.
Amol, I have spoken to a lot of your friends from Hostel 3, and they have a lot of interesting things to share about you, which I would like to now share with you. They remember you a lot for various things. They remember you a lot for your mathematical insight and intuition. One of your friends remembers how you explained the curl of a vector using a belt. They also remember you a lot for your friendship. And they say that you were always in the moment, very cheerful and happy to engage on every interesting topic. And you had an innate sense of what would be appropriate to say and what might be misconstrued. They say that You were always a wonderful team player. You always made everyone feel special by your greatest gift, namely the ability to listen first and then comment. They see you as a very reliable and trustworthy friend. They also feel that you were mature beyond your years and they could trust you with complete confidence. They also say that you always had time for your friends and you always had an open heart to listen. They also remember your collaboration. They say that they had many joint sessions to work on tutorial sheets together, and it was a great, wonderful learning experience for all. Everyone contributed in some way, no one was judged, and you were a great moderator. And on a very lighter note, they remember two other incidents. One is that you always loved to wear a striped pajama in the evening in the hostel. And there were many who walked up to you and said that that made you look like a jailed convict. But you never stopped wearing that striped pajama because you felt it was actually very comfortable. And there is another incident that they remember that once, additional chairs were available in Hostel 3. And you were one of the people who opted for the additional chair. And one of your wingmates asked you whether you are actually looking for another place to sit in your room with that chair. But your answer was that you actually wanted an additional surface to keep your books and papers on. So this is another incident that they remember you for. So Amol, your life and work is a source of great inspiration for all of us. All of us, from IIT Bombay are extremely inspired and very proud of you and your accomplishments. And it was really great for us to have this conversation today. And I wish you the very best. Thank you very much for spending the time on this timeless series of interviews. Thanks a lot, Amol.
Thank you, Vivek. You have been very kind, and my friends also have been very kind. I see that they haven't given away too many things of our interactions, so I put forth the good parts of my character, maybe exaggerated that a bit. But anyway, thanks to them, and thanks a lot to you. It was a pleasure chatting with you for a long time. I don't even know how much time has passed.
So thanks a lot. It was really wonderful, and see you then.
Okay, bye.